Africa last year, I also contributed something on
No, I
UN
didn't see that.
peacekeeping. But the lead piece is by him, and it just captures what is going on economically in Africa perfectly, and the whole thing about China is very nuanced and looks
That's
at the
what I
history of structural adjustment, and
Okay.
yeah, it's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'll definitely go look that up on
If you could get him and her
then it would be a
debating,
good counterbalance.
I mean, it will be quite an event. Yeah. Do you know her? You've met her, right?
Yeah, I
Okay.
met her a couple of times. I don't know her that well. I think she was about 2 or 3 years behind me at school.
Okay.
Many, many moons ago. But
Oh,
I really
okay.
don't say I know her.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how best to get to We'll ask Ade to speak very slowly, something he doesn't normally do.
You want me to speak very fast, though, surely?
We're good. So I want to thank all of you for braving the weather and coming out to this event, which is a really special event. And I think the weather has really played a number on us in the sense that we had over 100 people confirm. And the only thing we can attribute this is the bad weather outside. Nonetheless, I'm glad you came because I think this is a very, very important issue. And what we're doing here is hosting this event, which is part of a series of events launching a new book entitled Africa's Peacemakers, Nobel Prize Laureates of African Descent. And it's a collection of insightful essays edited by my good friend, Dr. Adekeye Adebajo. The book examines 13 prominent individuals of African descent who have won the Nobel Peace Prize since 1950 and offers some lessons learned from these individuals on peacemaking, socio-economic justice, women's rights, environmental protection, and nuclear disarmament. And so it's really looking at that intersection between justice, peace, and security. For those of you unfamiliar with the Woodrow Wilson Center, it was established in 1968 by an act of Congress, and unlike the many physical monuments in the nation's capital, it is a living memorial whose work and scholarship commemorates the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. Today, the Woodrow Wilson Center provides a safe political space where the worlds of policymaking and scholarships can intersect and interact. By conducting relevant and timely research and promoting dialogue from all perspectives, the Wilson Center works to address critical current and emerging challenges confronting the United States and the world. And the Africa program builds on the center's mission by addressing critical issues facing Africa and U.S. policy towards Africa, by fostering policy-focused dialogue and scholarship, and by enhancing knowledge and understanding of Africa and the United States. And we think this program feeds into all of those program areas that we are working on. I think it's especially, it's special for us to be hosting this event because, as many of you know, President Woodrow Wilson, for whom the center is named, was also a Nobel Prize winner for his work on the League of Nations. And we can have a discussion about whether that was a success or not, but I think it is an important tie to the work that we have here. It was an important concept, I think an important contribution to world peace and security, and laid the foundation actually for the United Nations, but it was a struggle to get from the League of Nations to the United Nations. So that is an important contribution, and I think this is an important point to make. For me personally, this is an important volume. It provides a picture of the contributions and achievements of 10 African and 13 African American Nobel Peace Laureates. As someone born and raised in Africa, the image that one grew up is of Africans who were consumers of peace rather than Africans who contributed to peace. So to have in one volume the acknowledgement of the contributions that Africans have made to peace and security, not just in Africa but globally, is for me a very, very important contribution. And for that, I must thank Ade and the authors who contributed to this volume. I think for me, the book also highlights the global nature of the struggle for peace, justice, and freedom. A few days ago, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and I took the opportunity to read the chapter on Dr. King that is contained in this volume. The civil rights movement was not just an American struggle. I think it reverberated around the world, and even though I grew up in Africa, this volume provides an opportunity for me and others to recognize those who have gone before us and on whose shoulders we stand. So it was a very important chapter for me to read. I haven't actually finished reading the entire book, but I certainly look forward to reading all of that. And I was mentioning to our two speakers today that of the chapters that I have read, it was interesting to me that the book also points out the personal flaws of some of the laureates. These are human beings like all of us who had their strengths and their weaknesses, and I think that's it provides more context to their contributions to the world. But it also provides a critique of the criteria by which the prize is given and its sometimes political nature, and I hope that Ade and Lee will touch on that as well. So let me now introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Adekeye Adebajo, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, South Africa, a position that he has held since 2003. He is also the author of 4 books, Building Peace in West Africa, Liberia's Civil War, The Curse of Berlin, and Africa After the Cold War, as well as UN Peacekeeping in Africa, from the Suez Canal to the Sudan conflicts, and is the co-editor of many, many more. Additionally, Ade is a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He has served in 4 United Nations missions in South Africa, actually 3, is that 4? 3, sorry. In South Africa, Western Sahara, and Iraq. Ade and I go back a long way. He obtained his doctorate from Oxford University in England, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. He is someone for whom I have tremendous respect. He's a good friend. He's one of the best writers that I know and an eloquent speaker, but I'll also warn you that he's also a very provocative one. And I do not always agree with him, but he certainly knows how to get the intellectual juices flowing. So I'm looking forward to a good session here. And he will provide us with an overview of the book, the 13 laureates covered in the book, and some of the key points and connections and highlights that he would like to draw from the chapters contained in the book. Our second speaker will be Mr. Lee Daniels, whom I knew of, but I got to meet for the first time today, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's here to join us. And he's one of the analysts and contributors to the book. And he's a columnist for National Newspapers Publishers Association and the blackpressusa.com. As a journalist, he has worked for the Washington Post and the New York Times, among other US media organizations. He's also a former editor of the National Urban League publication, The State of Black America, and a former director of communications for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He will speak to his chapter on Martin Luther King. And as I mentioned, it really was a special treat for me to read this chapter, and being reminded that Dr. King died before he even attained age 40. Was powerful to think of someone so young and the legacy that he has left us that reverberates not just in this country, but beyond. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing more of your take on Dr. King. And with that, let me turn it over to Ade, who will speak to us for 20 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Lee for another 20, and then hopefully we can have a discussion after that, followed by some refreshments and the book signing outside. So Ade.
Okay.
Provoke away, my friend.
Thank you very much, Monday, and thanks for your very generous introduction, though it's a bit disconcerting that you distance yourself from my views even before I've had a chance to utter them. What I intend to do is just to go through the introductory chapter, which is titled Obama's Noble Ancestors from Bunch to Barack and Beyond. In 2013, the African Union commemorated 50 years since the birth of its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, which embodied the quest for Pan-African unity. The AU has also designated the African diaspora as a 6th sub-region, which is a recognition, at least, of the continuing relevance of the historical links, even though this is probably more symbolic than substantive. The continent has also embarked since 1960 on a quest for what Kenyan political scientist Ali Mazrui described as a Pax Africana, a peace that is basically created and consolidated by Africans themselves. It's important, I think, therefore, to note that part of the rationale and motive and inspiration for writing this book or putting it together and bringing all the authors together is that we think that the links that were forged between the Africans and the diaspora and on the continent are disappearing following the anti-apartheid struggle and the anti-decolonization struggles. And we thought this could be a small contribution, at least, to trying to get a new generation to see the connections between the struggles that were waged by the diaspora and the continent. So the 13 Nobel Peace Laureates examined here are, in a sense, prophets of Pax Africana. The volume seeks to draw lessons for peacemaking, civil rights, socio-economic justice, environmental protection, nuclear disarmament, and women's rights, based on the rich experiences of the 13 Nobel laureates of African descent who won the prize between 1950 and 2011. These Nobel laureates share diverse backgrounds but have waged similar struggles for peace, justice, and freedom. The collection is lucid and jargon-free, so it tries to be essays that not only aim at a kind of specialist audience, but at generalists. And they're written by an interdisciplinary team of 14 African and African-American scholars and practitioners. And it's the first book, to our knowledge, that has comprehensively actually tried to address this important topic. So we have a scholar like Ali Mazrui writing on Obama, and a practitioner like Boutros Ghali, the former UN Secretary General and former Deputy Foreign Minister of Egypt, writing on his boss, Anwar Sadat. So the book has 3 African Americans, Ralph Bunche, Martin Luther King, and Barack Obama. It has 4 South Africans, Albert Luthuli, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, and controversially, F.W. de Klerk. It has 2 Egyptians in Anwar Sadat and Mohamed El-Baradei. We also look at Kenya's Wangari Maathai, Ghana's Kofi Annan, and then 2 Liberian women, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president, and Lema Gbowe. India's political spiritual leader, Mahatma Gandhi, was nominated for the prize 5 times, the Nobel Prize, that is, and shortlisted 3 times, but was controversially never awarded it, due, it is presumed, to the political clout of the British Empire, a country with close ties to Norway, which awards the prize. Gandhi's nonviolent struggle, however, served as an inspiration to 8 of our 13 Nobel Peace Laureates here: Bunche, Luthuli, King, Sadat, Tutu, Mandela, Obama, and Gbowe. These 15 essays seek to make connections between the struggles for peace, justice, and freedom. And, for example, Ralph Bunche and Martin Luther King marched together during the civil rights struggle of the 50s and 60s. Albert Luthuli and King issued a joint declaration against apartheid in 1962. Luthuli and Mandela, of course, waged the anti-apartheid struggle together in the 50s and 60s. And other connections and interactions, Kofi Annan and Mohamed El-Baradei were both self-effacing technocrats rather than politicians who rose up the ranks of their institutions, UN-related bodies, to try to serve as a force for good in the world. Johnson Sirleaf, Maathai, and Lema Gbowe all left their partners and left abusive partners and courageously pursued women's rights struggles through methods that directly confronted authority. Both El-Baradei and Maathai were involved in unorthodox struggles that sought to link nuclear disarmament and environmental protection to global security in a new framework of human security. Both El-Baradei and Obama shared the desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Over 2 centuries ago, Jesus of Nazareth had famously noted that no prophet is honored in his own land. 6 of our Nobel laureates suffered this fate. Bunche was more recognized in international circles than he was in the US. In fact, many US college students doing graduate degrees in international relations and related fields don't even know who Ralph Bunche actually is. So that's quite striking. Sadat was revered in the West but shunned and isolated in the Middle East and Africa. El-Baradei failed in his bid to play a more prominent political role in Egypt after retiring from his UN organization in 2009. Johnson Sirleaf failed disastrously in her first bid to become Liberia's president in 1997, while Maathai's environmental activism was more recognized abroad than it was in Kenya, even though it was very visionary in the 70s already to be dealing with those sorts of issues. 5 of our subjects, it's also important to note, Sadat, de Klerk, Mandela, Johnson Sirleaf, and Obama, were heads of states burdened by state power, who sometimes took difficult decisions that did not always accord to the principles of the struggles they were waging. So having kind of cleared the path, I think it's important just to go through in a bit more detail the 13 Nobel laureates, praising them and criticizing them where necessary. And then hopefully we can have some good discussion. Ralph Bunche was the scholar diplomat. He was the first black person, or person of color, as they sometimes say, to win the prize in 1950. His skillful mediation in the Middle East won him the award, and he served the UN for another 2 decades, being involved particularly in the Suez and the Congo crisis, though he had a terrible relationship with another Pan-African icon, Patrice Lumumba, and was accused by some Pan-Africanists as having pursued parochial American foreign policy interests in the Congo. The great provocateur, Martin Luther King Jr., as Lee calls him in his very elegant chapter, became the youngest winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 at the age of 35. And Bunche and him, of course, as I noted, marched together and waged the civil rights struggle together. I'll leave most of the detail to Lee on him. As the first African-American US president was preparing to send more troops to wage war in Afghanistan, word came through in October 2009 that Barack Obama had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Some of his foreign policy actions, however, have unfortunately followed in the hawkish footsteps of his predecessor, George W. Bush. While Bush ordered 50 drone strikes in 8 years of his presidency, Obama had ordered about 400 4.5 years into his presidency, and these drones have killed over 3,500 people, including innocent women and children. And I think it's important that those liberals who are blind to Obama actually acknowledge that we would be condemning Bush in the strongest terms if this was him doing it. So we need to be consistent in terms of how we analyze, I think, and how we speak truth to power. The previously idealistic president has been taught how to kill since becoming president 6 years ago. He often resembles a tragic Macbethian figure, unable to wipe the blood of his victims off his permanently stained hands. As the excellent movie Selma, which I hope all of you have seen, you should see, recently shows, the civil rights struggle that King had waged made possible the presidency of Barack Obama in 2008. Despite talk of a post-racial America, however, Obama's presidency has not transformed the lives of Black Americans in any fundamental way, nor has his presidency been transformative in my view. Blacks still make up about 40% of the prison population, despite being only about 13% of the general population. Unlike Martin Luther King, his fellow Nobel Peace Laureate and hero, Obama campaigned in pretty poetry, but has governed in pragmatic prose. Obama has largely been a cautious politician and often failed to stand up and fight for his beliefs. King's single-minded moral clarity in Selma stands in stark contrast to Obama's sometimes cynical use of power, as illustrated by the example of the drone strikes I just talked about. So it's important we actually judge him by what he does, not how eloquently he speaks. The president of South Africa's African National Congress, Albert Luthuli, between 1951 to 1967, won the award as the first African Peace Laureate in 1960, and the award was an attempt to highlight apartheid's brutalities in South Africa. Luthuli was a priest and traditional chief from rural KwaZulu-Natal, and for him, the road to freedom lay through the cross, and sacrifices and suffering would be required to translate Jesus' love ethic into concrete achievements. So the cross necessarily had to come before the crown. There had to be sacrifice and suffering before victory. In 1984, the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu, another troublesome priest like Lutuli, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his quest for socio-economic justice in apartheid South Africa. Tutu was a fearless anti-apartheid activist who would wade into crowds in volatile black townships in his purple cassock to prevent people from being neckless, from being burnt alive. But he has a somewhat narcissistic side to him, of course, as, for example, hobnobbing with Bono and Bob Geldof, people who often trivialize African causes. Bono actually serenaded him during his 80th birthday. And he can also be an unguided missile, as when he said that the ANC government was worse than the apartheid one, after his friend and fellow Nobel laureate, the Dalai Lama, had been denied a visa to visit South Africa in 2011. Nelson Mandela, to whom the book is dedicated, the book was going to press as Mandela died in December of 2013, emerged from 27 years in jail preaching a message of reconciliation with his former enemies. The charisma of this founding father helped South Africa's young democratic institutions to flower and gave the country an international stature of which a former pariah could never have dreamt. Critics, of course, have noted that Mandela may have ended up doing more long-term damage by papering over the racial differences in South Africa. The national high priest appears to have absolved whites of their sins without proper confession and penance. But Mandela's legacy is secure, and in terms of historical stature, his place in South Africa's history will be akin to, as a founding father, George Washington in the US or Mahatma Gandhi in India. In a television interview with Christian Amanpour on CNN in 2012, apartheid's last president, F.W. de Klerk, caused widespread outrage when he appeared to defend the apartheid system, which had legalized racism in South Africa. The greater outrage may actually have been that so many people were surprised by de Klerk's views because he had put these views on record for over 2 decades, even writing an autobiography in 1991. Repudiating apartheid would have represented an act of political parricide for de Klerk. He did not help end apartheid because it was morally repugnant, but because, in his own words, it failed as a system of political control. But I guess he has to be given some credit for being a partner with Mandela in the crucial years of 1990 to 1994 when apartheid was being dismantled, and for basically committing political suicide. The president of Egypt from 1970 to 81, Anwar Sadat, the tragic peacemaker, used to, as a child, dress up like Gandhi and meditate on the roof of his home in Cairo. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize after a historic trip to Jerusalem in 1977. Sadat gambled that going to war against Israel would secure peace. He thus paradoxically waged war in order to achieve peace. He drew from his experiences of traditional leaders in Egyptian villages, sitting together to eat and resolve issues. True to his peasant roots, he felt he needed to break bread with the enemy and talk. Sadat was single-minded and stubborn. He took risks for peace, but his arrogance, naivety, and exaggerated trust in Washington sometimes turned out to be reckless. In the end, he was killed by his own soldiers during a parade in 1981, martyred for peace. Egypt's second Nobel Peace Laureate in 2005 was Mohammed El-Baradei, the Rocket Man, who was Director General of the Vienna-based UN International Atomic Energy Agency. And he exposed the twisted logic in the irrational American approach, attacking a country, Iraq, without nuclear weapons, while vacillating while another, North Korea, acquired them. Ghana's Kofi Annan is our next laureate to be examined in a chapter by Gwendolyn Mickle, which is a bit more favorable than my own view of Kofi Annan. He served as UN Secretary General between 1997 and 2006, and during his tenure sought to act as a secular pope on the East River, promoting humanitarian intervention and such issues. But one lingering accusation that Kofi Annan has never been able to shake off is that while acting as head of UN peacekeeping during the Rwandan genocide, he had acted too timidly in warning the Security Council and others of the impending genocide, and the commission of inquiry that he set up in 1999 criticized him for that very issue. And Kofi Annan, in the end, was also a bit naive about his American godfathers who had put him, or godmother, since it was Madeleine Albright who had put him in power. And over Iraq and other issues, he started clashing with America, particularly in his second term, when he was turned into a lame duck effectively by the George W. Bush administration. And he finally and painfully discovered the ancient wisdom that one needs a long spoon to sup with the devil. Kenyan environmental campaigner Wangari Maathai died from cancer at the age of 71 in September 2011, a month before two African women joined the elite ranks of Nobel Peace Laureates. Africa's Earth Mother fought tirelessly to save the country's forests and fight for the plight of rural women. She would eventually, with the Green Belt movement, help to plant 30 million trees across the continent. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2011 for championing women's rights 4 days before a presidential election must count as one of the most political acts in the history of the prize. It would be hard to imagine the prize being awarded to an American or European leader 4 days before an election, because it would be seen as trying to sway that election in some way or other. This prize also demonstrated the enormous gulf in perception between Johnson Sirleaf and those in West Africa and in Liberia themselves. Even though she did help cancel Liberia's debt of about $6 billion and has attracted $16 billion in foreign direct investment, she also made the misjudgment of paying $10,000 to Charles Taylor at the beginning of his rebellion. So in handing him over to a war crimes trial, one also has to question her own role in supporting this warlord. Lemagboe, a 41-year-old Liberian former social worker and prayerful peace warrior, has been a key figure in West Africa's women's movements. She served on Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but resigned as head of the commission in 2012, accusing Johnson Sirleaf of nepotism. She has her sons in key positions in her government, as if there's some genetical disposition making them the only ones that with the brains to run the country, and of neglecting to address the widening gap between rich and poor. So, Chair, in concluding, none of Obama's 12 fellow laureates were in a powerful enough position to secure world peace. The young Afro-Saxon president of the most powerful nation on earth was the first Nobel Peace Laureate of African descent who has a chance to leave an indelible mark on global peace and security. He may, however, have left it a bit too late. I want to end where I started, with Gandhi, the most deserving Nobel laureate, scandalously to have been denied it. And he said in 1936, and I quote, that it was maybe through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. We certainly saw some evidence of that in the excellent movie Selma, and it's maybe through the example of the 13 prophets of Pax Africana examined in this book could this prophecy yet be fulfilled. Amen.
All Right, thank you, Ade. A lot of information there and things for us to discuss in the Q&A. Lee, let me turn it over to you to talk to us about Dr. King, and then we'll proceed from there.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm very happy to be with you today. Very proud of being part of the wonderful book that Ade has put together. My remarks about Martin Luther King are organized along 4 points. One, that King came along, historically speaking, at the right time to lead Black America in the final stage of claiming its sense of self and to lead the great confrontation between America's idealism and white America's addiction to the crime of white supremacy. 2, that he represented the post-World War II Black freedom struggle better than any of the movement's other heroes, many other heroes, from Ella Baker to James Farmer to Stokely Carmichael to Daisy Bates to Rosa Parks to Roy Wilkins, Medgar Evers, Fannie Lou Hamer. That list is a very, very long one, but King was the best representative of them all. That his last 4 years, when he rejected the seductive allure of establishment acceptance, as well as bitter, even vitriolic criticism from a growing number within the movement, and kept moving ever leftward, were his finest hours. And that finally he was taken via assassination from the world at just the right moment to both free the Black freedom struggle from the hindrance, I use that word advisedly, of his physical presence, and to ensure that his legacy would endure to provide that struggle inspiration for the difficult days ahead. Also, in the interest of full disclosure, I should reveal what Ade knows. Due to my growing up in Boston in the 1960s, I have a minor but direct historical connection to King. As teenagers, my brother and I attended 12th Baptist Church, which is descended from the first church Black Bostonians established in the late 1700s. This is the church where King, while at Boston University School of Theology in the early 1950s, was a co-junior minister. His associate was Reverend Michael E. Haynes. Haynes and King became such good friends that when King got the call in 1954 from Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he asked Haynes to go with him as his associate pastor. Haynes, who was Boston born and bred, and by the way, the younger brother of the renowned jazz drummer Roy Haynes, laughingly, so he said in later years, told King that in 1954 there was no way he was going to Montgomery, Alabama, or anywhere else in the South. But they remained very close, and that connection led in June of 1965 to a picture, since that day in Haynes' possession, which shows me and several other boys who were also Mike Haynes' protégés, standing in the very small minister's office of 12th Baptist Church next to Martin Luther King, Jr. That's the picture of a lifetime. Now to the first point I mentioned, that King came along at the right time. This is obvious when one considers both the post-World War II rising to power of the anti-colonial movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the critical massing of Blacks in the urban centers of the North and the South, and the spread among Blacks of what my college tutor, Professor Martin Kilson, calls the challenge demeanor dynamic among Black Americans. That was the quiet, unshakable determination that after the Second World War fought, so the great white powers loved to boast, to make the world safe for democracy, Blacks were finished enduring the racist laws and racist customs which had the force of law. That attitude, which had been dramatically expressed in A. Philip Randolph's threat of a march on Washington in 1951, and in the Double V for Victory campaign Blacks declared during the war, led directly to the Supreme Court's Brown school desegregation decision, of 1954 and the mass action phase of the Black freedom struggle that came into being the following year with the Montgomery bus boycott. These years saw the fruition of what I call Black Americans' recovery from Plessy, the Supreme Court's infamous decision of 1896, validating racism as the law of the land. That devastating decision had demanded, as the great W.E.B. Du Bois understood, that blacks, amid the wrenching transformations of the modernizing world, actually consider the question, were they inferior? He memorably described one byproduct of that consideration in his 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk, as Black Americans' double consciousness, and put the question that every individual Black American and blacks as a group must consider in blunt terms. How does it feel to be a problem? Blacks' great achievement over the course of the next 6 decades was to expand the definition and use of double consciousness. It became not only a tool of self-diagnosis, but also a means of examining white America's attitudes and behavior as well. In other words, Black Americans refashioned double consciousness from a burden into a compass and a gyroscope to steady themselves and plot their course along the arduous trek from Plessy to the civil rights victories of the 1960s. That transformation merged with their commitment to nonviolent political reform and with what is hardly ever acknowledged, a fervent allegiance to America itself, to produce the extraordinary mass discipline, stoic courage, and self-sacrifice that astonished the world. In that regard, one of the great achievements of Anna DuVernay's Selma is its showing that those qualities were evident in both the civil rights leadership and in the Black masses and their white allies, albeit the perfectly human wrangling that went on among the leadership most of the time. Those allegiances built what those in the movement called the beloved community. James Farmer, one of the other heroic figures of the mid-century freedom struggle, put it this way in his book, Lay Bare the Heart, an autobiography of the civil rights movement. Living was tenuous in movement days, he wrote, but the grasping at liberty and the reaching toward happiness ennobled life for this nation. Of course, there were other forces which helped bring the mass action movement into being and aided its success. These included America's post-war global dominance and the resulting affluent society, as John Kenneth Galbraith famously put it, which created the foundation for the flowering of political liberalism and the explosion of consumerism. The coming of age of the baby boomers and of that cohort of Americans born in the early years of the war, who, influenced mightily by the drive for profits of the nation's consumer capitalist sector, would grow up believing they deserved to have what they wanted. The broader social consciousness ferment of the era that would produce in the early 1960s such call-to-arms books as Michael Harrington's The Other America, Rachel Carson's The Silent Sea, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. The development of television as a crucial instrument in filling the American public's new hunger for news, which leads to the final point on this list, the election of John F. Kennedy as president. Kennedy's use of television both during his long campaign for the White House and during his presidency ushered in the age of television journalism as we know it. That's important in its own right, but it's also important because television played a crucial role in illuminating the civil rights movement in the South. That movement provided such great television theater, stark set pieces of good and evil in literally black and white, punctuated by horrific incidents of violence. Thus it was the civil rights movement, not the Vietnam conflict, that became America's first living room war, a war in which, again, as Selma the film so poignantly shows, brutal violence and death was a constant presence, a constant menace. My second point, that King was the movement's best representative, not only because he was a preacher, and blacks and whites, for different reasons then, were comfortable with the concept of a preacher as Negro leader, but also because he could and did speak to and for the people. He had that perfect voice, that rich baritone, and speaking in terms of the medium of television, he came across, like JFK, as cool, and therefore somewhat mysterious, but possessing extraordinary latent power. This is what you see in his performance at the March on Washington of the Dream speech, which, contrary to the impression many people seem to have of it, is not a simple plea for peace and brotherhood, but a powerfully complex secular sermon full of hidden in plain sight demands and warnings to white America, along with the call to our better selves. Martin Luther King wasn't the movement's organizational leader nor its tactician, but its chief national and international spokesman. Using that voice and big words and concepts some of us had never heard before, he could turn emotions into words and words into emotions that were sometimes otherwise inexpressible. In a movement overflowing with powerful speakers, both rough-hewn and smooth, King was the best. Further, with his powerful oratory and an aura of erudition that fit him like a glove, he was the perfect counter to the white man standing opposite him in the early 1960s, blocking the path to the federal government fully committing itself to the freedom struggle. I'm speaking of the man who could be described in historical terms as King's fraternal twin, John F. Kennedy. It was Kennedy who, as a president whose entire legislative program was a nearly complete captive of the Southern racists who dominated the Congress then, perfectly represented those white Americans who, in terms of the movement's progress, counted. Those who were largely ignorant of or indifferent to the racism blacks endured, or were immobilized by the seeming impossibility of defeating the white South's rabid racist culture, but who could be moved to do the right thing by the contrast between the commitment to evil that was the foundation of American racism and the relentless courage of the moral suasion brand of nonviolence. It was the movement's task, as King and the others well knew, to show America's white majority that ending Jim Crow couldn't wait on their political and psychological convenience. King couched those demands most often in the high-sounding lexicon of morality, justice, peace, redemption, and brotherhood that engaged the sense of decency of many beyond the boundaries of Black America. JFK fully committed himself to the movement's primary legislative goals just before his time on earth was up. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, the great fixer, astutely used Kennedy's martyrdom and his prodigious political skills to expand that legislation and get it through an initially recalcitrant Congress. And then things got complicated. The stunning Black rebellion in the Watts ghetto of Los Angeles occurred within a fortnight of the signing of the Voting Rights Act in July of 1965 and ushered in a wave of long, hot summers that would leave many northern inner cities scarred for decades. Those eruptions, plus the continuing racist violence against the movement in the South, seemed to prove to many blacks and whites, again considering the 1960s from different perspectives, that both the concept of nonviolence as a tool of advancement and King himself were outdated, as Tavis Smiley recounts in a very important new book on King's last year of life. To me, the last 4 years of King's life are when he really proved his mettle. His commitment to nonviolence grew deeper in the late 1960s period of extraordinary turmoil, as the black ghettos exploded, as Stokely Carmichael's call for black power resounded throughout black America, and to a far different effect throughout white America. And as King came to openly oppose the war in Vietnam, a stance which produced substantial dissension within his own organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a virtual break with Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, with Whitney Young, with the National Urban League, with Ralph Bunche, with much of the black political leadership, all of whom were stalwart Johnson partisans. I say these years were King's finest hours because he withstood the seductive post-Nobel Prize blandishments of the establishment, beat back the despair over his organization's declining treasury and influence and his own virtual poverty, and fought off knowing that J. Edgar Hoover was tracking him, and had, via wiretaps and visual surveillance, irrefutable proof of his compulsive philandering, which Hoover was always threatening to make public. King fully accepted his historical role as the great challenger of the status quo and of reforms that are no more than markers of the unfinished business yet ahead, as the great civil rights acts were. And so at the end of his life, he was trying to organize a national interracial mass movement, the Poor People's March, and lending his weight to a local movement of poor black people, the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, seeking economic and social justice. Finally, we can see in hindsight that just as King appeared on the scene at the right moment in the wake of the Brown decision, he was taken from us at just the right moment as well, before his reputation could be tarnished by, first, the inevitable failure of his Poor People's March that summer, which I'm convinced would have been completely undermined not only by the showy black militants, but also by government-sponsored agents provocateurs who infested the movement. That in turn would have given Hoover and the right wing the opening to unleash the FBI tapes of King's compulsive philandering. Those two developments would not only have destroyed King's reputation, they would have besmirched the entire civil rights movement as well. So ironically, King's assassins effectively ensured that he would remain a source of inspiration to black America, even as many blacks shelved his philosophical or ethical brand of nonviolence and devoted their whole energies to that pragmatic nonviolent tool, the vote and political mobilization, for waging the next stage of the freedom struggle. That saving of King's reputation was doubly important because I'm convinced that the 16-year struggle for the King National Holiday, John Conyers submitted the first bill proposing a holiday 4 days after King was killed, can be considered the cornerstone of Black America's subsequent struggle to beat back the racist reaction to the movement's 1960s victories and build the political infrastructure and common sense that resulted in Barack Obama's election to the presidency. Martin Luther King's words and courage in nonviolently confronting seemingly overwhelming power is the reason he remains so compelling a figure to so many today. In that regard, however, those of us on the right side of history ought to consider our current predicament a bracing reminder of the lesson King learned. Just because you achieve significant victories does not mean the war is over. On the last full night of his life in the mountaintop speech, Martin Luther King Jr. made a promise that seemingly everyone has latched onto ever since. He said that Black Americans as a people will get to the promised land. I've never believed that. Not that night of April 4th, 1968, the end of my first year in college, and not for a moment since. Instead, what I picked up on were the words he uttered a few sentences before that pledge. He warned, "We've got some difficult days ahead." And I, not having a close relationship with the Bible, immediately wondered, had King used the word days in the modern or the biblical sense? I've always felt it was the latter. We've lived through difficult days. We are in difficult days, and the difficult days will continue. This has always been and will continue to be the destiny of Americans of African descent in this, our native land, because our historical and present-day function is to be America's tutors of what democracy means, and thus of what it means to be an American. King's words and actions seem relevant again because they've always challenged the status quo and always urged individuals to live up to humanity's best possibilities. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. is no longer confined to that visually distant, two-dimensional universe and limited to speaking a single sentence shorn of its context and thus of its true meaning. That's why his example and his words still resonate in our time, because they need to. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our speakers for some very thoughtful presentations. I think a lot of information and issues that you raise. I would normally take the liberty of asking the first question as chair, but I recognize we started late and I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions and engage our speakers. So the floor is open. If you just identify yourself, the organization that you represent, and which of our speakers you're directing your question to, and we'll get rolling. And so I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So the floor is open. Sorry.
I'm Bashir, colleague at the Wilson Center. Thank you both very much. Very thoughtful presentation. We currently live in a era that's parsed and divided in sectarian ways. And I'm wondering, from the standpoint of Nobel Prize, of peacemaking broadly, celebrated by the prize, as well as the civil rights campaign in this country throughout the 1960s. I grew up in Boston. Louise Day Hicks was an issue. Nothing was an issue. To what extent does cross-sectarian communication, either within Christianity, Protestants and Catholics, or across the Abrahamic religions more broadly, play, both with respect to those who were able to promote peace and be recognized for it, but also to gain civil liberties in this country? I mean, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was Christian, and whites in the South were Christian. That, at some point, may have been a common focal point, even with all the huge cultural differences and the racism which you mentioned. So I just wanted to ask you both to respond to that general issue of how we should think about sectarian divides or unity in the items you're discussing. Thank you.
Lee, you want to go, and then I'll turn to Adi?
Well, that's a very interesting question. You know, King has been, to a certain extent, secularized. And it's only recently that, in the turning our attention again to King, that some people have begun to pay more attention to his religious beliefs. Cornell West has just come out, right, with the book, a new book, collection of King's speeches, showing his radicalism. The title of the book is called The Radical King. And Cornell says in the introduction that King was a revolutionary Christian, right? And certainly one, during the years of the movement, the place of religion was front and center. It's not been front and center in the post-1960s treatment of the movement. But from the gospel songs, which were then turned into movement anthems, to King's own sermons, the role of Christianity first and then tolerance for the Western religious tradition and mention of Buddhism, for example, was just part of the fabric of the movement. My brother and I were, in the early 1960s, as teenagers, we were in a freedom choir that was based in an Episcopal church, St. John's Episcopal, in Roxbury. And that was part of the community of civil rights connected Episcopal priests. James Reeb, who was killed in Selma, and the film shows it. James Reeb was part of that collective, although I didn't know him. In Eric Etheridge's book, Breach of Peace, which shows the mugshots of all the Freedom Riders of 1961, in the very last group of Freedom Riders, in which Stokely was arrested, and so his picture is in that. They were arrested September 13th, 1961. Two of the people pictured, Jim Breeden and Gil Avery, were in that circle. And Gil Avery was pastor of St. John's Episcopal Church. And Jim Breeden, who was black, was pastor of another Episcopal church in Roxbury and went on to be chaplain at Dartmouth. But one couldn't escape the fortifying role of Christianity. And of course, David Garrow's book, right, the title comes from bearing the cross. And Christianity fortified the sense of rightness of self-sacrifice that the movement demanded. And so does the turn then perhaps the greater exploration that may be going on now, certainly Cornell is trying to do his part, of exploring the role of religion, religious sentiment, both active Christianity and within the movement, the tolerance of and the appreciation of religion as a motivating force, as a fortifying force. Will that result in a greater acknowledgement of the role religion can play in peacemaking? Because I think, maybe my prejudice, but that far more attention is being paid to King today. Again, because it needs to be paid to him and what he represented. And the fact that he was a radical. Right? When you read the speeches, when you read the sermons, you see that he was a revolutionary, in fact.
How do you have?
Yeah, just a couple of, my examples aren't big ones, but I think Mandela, for example, was always very conscious of reaching out along religious lines, so that, for example, during his inauguration, he made sure that you had a rabbi, an imam, and a priest talk, and he would also make sure that he visited and reached out to and embraced various religions. I think Lutuli and Tutu, in their own way, too, tried to reach out as much as they could, because it had to be a broad movement that they were in terms of the anti-apartheid struggle. The final example is Lema Bowie in Liberia. When she had a dream, she thought that she had a dream calling on her to basically gather the women to pray. And she was obviously very steeped in the Christian religion, but reached out to Muslim women as well, and they all wore white and prayed together to put pressure on the factions, Charles Taylor and the Lord, to make peace together. And that was also an example, I think, where you had a multi-religious group trying to act in favor of peace.
Thank you. Connie.
Connie Freeman, currently with Syracuse University's Maxwell School. I guess I would direct my question primarily at Ade, although would be glad for comments from the others. Ade, you've spent so much time getting steeped in all of these very impressive Nobel laureates and symbols of peace from the continent. It would be very interesting to hear your views on who do you see on the scene now who is most likely to be a primary peacemaker for the continent or for the world, and possibly candidate for a Nobel Prize at a time when making peace on the continent is both as important or more important than it has ever been, and perhaps more complicated.
It's a good, tough question, but good question. Any other question, or shall I? Yes, Danton.
John Thorne, Majuk with the Wilson Center. I just bought the book. I haven't read it yet, but what came to mind when I saw the title is these are Nobel Peace Laureates, mostly from African descent, and most of them are within the continent. Is it not paradoxical or ironical that we have this peace laureate from the continent, but then somewhat the continent is being portrayed as being engulfed in a turmoil of civil war and all this fight, when the peace laureates are also there? How do you reconcile this and maybe paint an image going forward? In addition to that too, does the Nobel Peace Prize become now more political than its original intent in the way it is now being given some of the examples you just showed? Thanks.
I think two good questions, and I see my good friend Mel just walked in, so I'll take a third.
Yeah, Mel Foote, constituency for Africa. I apologize for being late. I was watching some of it online, and I heard my brother say that Barack Obama has not been transformative. And I take exception to that, in the sense that when I think about the end of his presidency, we're going to look at kids all across America who are going to be up to 8 years old who won't know anything other than a black president, you know? So when they think about American history, they're going to think about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Barack Obama, you know. So in many respects, it's been absolutely transformative, you know. And I watched the State of the Union last night, and man, I looked at how these people are dealing with this guy. This guy has actually been great, you know. So I just wanted to get your thought on that. I mean, he's not Martin Luther King. And I think Martin Luther King would be the first one to say he's not Barack Obama either, you know. So anyway, I think that you know, we're moving along. And also, you know, in the United States, we're trying to build support for Africa through the diaspora. And we're having a hell of a time trying to get African immigrants, African Americans, African Caribbean, Afro-Latinos, and others to agree that we're African, you know. Everybody wants to seem to pull their own way. And I'd like to see if you got any thoughts or ideas about going forward. How do we unite in a sense of common purpose, common objective? Because I think that's what Martin Luther King really was about. Thank you.
Okay, you've got a lot to work with there. So a number of questions about who you see currently as being likely to be a good candidate for the prize going forward on the continent, reconciling all the presence of all these peace laureates on the continent with the image of Africa as being constantly in conflict, and how can we work on that? And also whether the Peace Prize has become more political over the years. And then my good friend Mel here takes exception with whether President Obama has been transformative or not, and how we can get the diaspora to better unite on issues that matter to the continent. So, Ade, you go first this time, and then
Okay.
we can get his thoughts together.
Thanks. Excellent questions. Thank you very much. I think in terms of the future laureates, I mean, it's very hard to identify individuals. There are many people that are doing peacemaking in Africa, and many of them tend to be former presidents. So Mbeki, for example, has been very involved in doing peacemaking in Sudan and between Sudan and South Sudan. You've had Obasanjo sometimes parachuting into different situations in the Great Lakes and elsewhere. And much earlier, you had a President Masire that was involved also. I mean, I think it's not a bad idea that have people that have been in power and have a lot of experience and understanding of the terrain of African politics being involved in peacemaking. I, however, don't think that there will be any Nobel laureates to come out of their ranks. I mean, you can't even get Mo Ibrahim to award his prize to any of these former leaders. For 3 years now, I think he's held on to his money. So I don't think that the future laureates will come from their ranks. I think they're more likely to come from civil society. You know, people who quietly are working at the grassroots level at their local communities, people of the kind of profile of Lemagboe. You know, there was a Congolese doctor who got the European Union award, who has been doing a lot of very good work in the, rape-infested Eastern Congo, in kind of lending his own skills and support. And you have a lot of civil society groups also in the rest of the Great Lakes, in West Africa, in North Africa, who have been waging women's struggles and democratic struggles. I think future laureates are more likely to come from those kind of sectors than the kind of big man or big woman profile of Nobel laureates. That would be my take. In terms of the question on Africa's image, it's true. I mean, the way the Western media kind of thinks, it can't seem to handle more than one image at a time. So Africa is either going to hell or it's going to heaven. Africa is either rising or it's falling. You know, The Economist in 2000 declared us the hopeless continent, and then 13 years later, we're rising and we're the hopeful continent. I think it's important to have a more nuanced view of the continent anyway. We're neither going to hell or heaven. We're going to stay in purgatory until we get things sorted out. And there will be some countries that do better or worse, just like Latin America or Europe or anywhere else, you know, or Asia. So I think that point is worth making. You know, so I would say that just as we have a Mandela, we've also had an Abacha or a Mobutu, but you've also had a genocidaire in Cambodia and had Gandhi. So I don't see the fact that we've produced 13 Nobel laureates as necessarily changing our image. I think, like everywhere else, we have to put this in a universalist discourse, which is why it's important to have members of the diaspora like Obama and Ralph Bunche and others in there as well. I don't think having Nobel Peace Laureates is necessarily going to change the image of the continent, although I guess Mandela did contribute to having a more positive image of the continent. But I think we must always keep insisting on a nuanced discourse. That's the way I would deal with that. Whether the prize has been politicized or not, it's always been political. Right from the start. The fact that Gandhi did not get the Nobel Prize was a political act. and it was because the Norwegians felt they did not want to annoy or alienate or whatever the British Empire at the time, which Gandhi was fighting. Kissinger getting the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, somebody described that as making satire obsolete. The idea of this warmonger getting a peace prize did not sit well with everybody. In fact, I think you had a resignation from the Nobel Committee, and of course the Vietnamese Foreign Minister Le Duc Thu refused to take the prize with Kissinger because he said that the war was not over. When Arafat got the award, one of the committee members also resigned because they did not feel that Arafat represented a peacemaker. And don't forget that until the 1940s, this prize basically went to Western actors and international organizations. It was only from after the Second World War that they started recognizing people outside the Western canon and the Western world. So in a way, it's always been political, and it will remain political. I mean, the way that, as I said, giving it to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, even giving it to Obama as he's in the middle of trying to withdraw from some wars and sending drones to kill people, is, you can say, a political act. And the main reason he got it was because he wasn't George Bush. So it is a political prize. I don't think we should get away from that, despite the fact that many people that have got it have waged amazing struggles, like your Martin Luther Kings and Mandela. So it's rather a bit like the Oscars, I think you should see it as. It's also extremely political. Sometimes they don't give it to people who deserve to get it, but most of the great people do end up getting it. In terms of Obama and being transformative, the question that my brother asked there, I think it's a fascinating question. You know, Obama's probably the first president, the first out of 44, who made history by turning up in the White House on the first day. He made history just by winning. So I take the point that him being there as the most powerful man on earth sends a very strong message to lots of black children and even to the white power structure, many of whom can't stand his guts. I think that's important, but I think we also have to assess him on the terms on which we would assess other presidents as well. And if we assess him on that basis, I think in terms of his foreign policy, it's been as belligerent as what you've seen from many other American presidents. I mean, many people try to justify this by saying that, you know, every American president has to have a war or has to drop bombs on somebody. But I don't personally take that as justification, especially when you read, he's actually one of the few presidents that have put his views on record in 2 books before he took office. And if you read the critique that Obama had in his 2 books of American power and how abusive it was and gunboat diplomacy, I mean, it was one of the most stinging critiques you can imagine. So we expected him to be different, transformative in the sense of, you know, an FDR or a Lincoln, whom he often compared himself to. But he's fallen far short of that. I think he will have some achievements, of course. I mean, he also has had terrible enemies. You know, if you have 20% of Republicans voters believing that he may be the Antichrist, or a third of them believing that he's a closet Muslim, it tells you about the kind of level of discourse and debate and the types of enemies he has. So I understand all of that very well in terms of the context, but I think he will get credit, for example, for his health care. He will get credit on Cuba. I think those are historic if they're not reversed. But I do think that he needs to be criticized for the drone warfare, for Guantanamo, for some of the stuff that has happened in terms of breaching privacy. I mean, if you see the Edward Snowden documentary, it's almost like Obama is having an out-of-body experience sometimes when prisoners are force-fed in Guantanamo, and he's kind of talking as if he's not responsible for that. That will be a blot on his record that I don't think we can take away. But I think he's also shown some leadership in Africa. I mean, his stance on Ebola and sending the troops and showing leadership and talking very rationally and trying to mobilize support, I think was good. But he's also described his greatest regret in a New York Times op-ed with that Tom Friedman wrote after an interview with him, as taking part in that NATO intervention in Libya and then not planning for the post-war consequences and seeing a Libya in absolute anarchy these days. So, like everybody else, he has successes, he has failures, but he hasn't transformed America. Black Americans have grown poorer under Obama.
I tend to agree and disagree with what Ade just said. I think he is a transformative president. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted to say that in terms of what I said at the end of my talk, that I don't believe in the promised land. Some people might think that because I don't believe in the promised land, I'm not an optimist, but I am an optimist. And I just think that the struggle is all there is, that the journey is what it is. It's not some notion of an Eden. It's the quality of life in the struggle. You know, what James Farmer said. For those who were alive in the 1960s and were anyways involved in the movement, and you see it in Selma, it's the quality of the commitment to the movement. It's the ennobling of the experience. I think that's what is important, and what I've seen the film, and I saw it with about 60 to 70 school kids. And I think that's what many children are going to take away from it. It is the planting of a view of history, even though that history is somewhat wrong, as it has to be because it's just a movie. But a view of history and planting questions in the minds of 12 to 13 to 14 to 15-year-olds about what happened, that in and of itself is going to be transformative, just as the movement itself from 1954 to 1965 was transformative for a lot of people, and which bore fruit that led to, as I said, Obama's election, but bore all different kinds of fruit. So in that sense, it's going to be transformative. That is Obama's presidency, and he's going to be a transformative figure because in the larger sense, we're in an era of transformation itself. The United States is in a transformative moment, a moment of most likely shedding some of the arrogance of all that talk of American exceptionalism, and that we can do no wrong, which was punctured by the debacle in Vietnam. And people always talked about how with the coming of Reagan, we had gotten over Vietnam, right? But it was clear that we hadn't gotten over Vietnam. And we may be beginning to get over Vietnam. And what does get over mean? One of the things it means is the considerable distrust of any government military adventure. Considerable distrust. There's some bad things to that, but anyway, it's all these transformative forces have come together, both internationally and domestically. The working out of the post-colonial era in Africa, which is still going on, right? The transformation, the continuing transformation of China, which, you know, when I grew up was simply called Red China and did not exist, right? The casting off into exile of Cuba and the assassination plots against Castro, and that, you know, that incident of you had all these, the American government talking about freedom and democracy while countenancing murder for hire or murder contracted out through the CIA and various people around the world and so forth. Or in the case of British Guiana, simply destroying the government because the guy, the president, was a sympathizer with Castro. He wasn't planning to do anything. They simply destroyed. So you had these enormous contradictions, which King saw. And when King started moving out of his comfort zone, the zone that the American leadership had marked out for him, you just talk about the Negroes. Then they came after him, right? I know I've wandered a bit, but that period of transformation that really began, one can argue, began with Brown, right? The beginning of the shredding of the myths about America. And once the shredding started, the shredding went a whole lots of places. Again, Betty Friedan's book and the transformation that was a cause of and was an effect of. And so I think that many of the things we're talking about Obama will only be seen in hindsight. If you look at the discussion about the very rich discussion about John F. Kennedy, right, and all the phases that the discussion about John F. Kennedy's presidency has gone through. And, you know, in Selma, in the film Selma, the Lyndon Johnson character is a mix of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, right? It's a mix, which some people don't seem to get, and some people don't like, right? But again, Kennedy was systemically necessary to the movement, right? Because the movement had to prove that they were not going to be turned around. And Kennedy had to move to the movement's position, right? Well, he represented that, as I said, he represented that sector of white America. So the era of transformation is multifaceted. And just to close it off, when Sonia Sotomayor, right, was nominated, you got a couple of pieces in the media that said there were all these 13, 14, 15 Latina girls across the country who in 5, 10, 15 years are going to be showing up on the screen. And Selma is going to do that, just as Barack is going to do that for not only black children, but other children as well, because that kind of influence crosses all sorts of boundaries.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I just wanted to add that from my perspective, I'd have to come down on the side of transformation, that this has been a transformative presidency. Not only, I think if you look at 2008 as a snapshot, President Obama's election, for me anyway, really captured all the transformation that had been occurring in this country over the years. So there's that aspect of it, that this was a very visible real result of how America had changed since the civil rights movement. And this was confirmed for me, I think, when you look back at the Obama presidency. We have to remember that this is a black president who's been elected not once but twice. And we have
doesn't that show how much trouble America was in?
No, Ade.
Then
Let me finish my thought.
Yeah.
And I think for me, if you put that in the context of, and maybe I'm being too African here, but hey, here I go. But if you put that in the context of black people make up 12% of the population in this country. There's no way that just black people would have been able to elect President Obama twice. I know it's a very, it seems like a very superficial point, but for me it really captured how much this country is transforming. That's not to say that there aren't issues that still need to be addressed. So I just wanted to get that on the table to say, it is a process of transformation. It is not just one moment in history, that you have to factor in all of these other issues, the long journey. It is not a snapshot. It's more like a reel, a film reel, that you have to look both to the past and to the future in order to really get a sense of that transformation. If you mean revolution, then we'll be having a totally different discussion. But if you mean transformation, I really think we need to account for those factors. Sorry, I did.
Can I say one small thing, which is that I think we shouldn't mix up historic with transformative. Obama's presidency and election was historic, just as Hillary Clinton's would be historic. But whether it transforms the society or not, I understand a transformative society as one like FDR, where you're actually changing the country. You're breaking up monopolies, or by the time you leave, the country is different from how you found it. That's the way I understand a transformative presidency. So I would say it's more historic than transformative. It may transform the mentality of America in some ways, yes, you can say that. But whether his presidency is transformative, I'm not sure. You have some audience members.
Oh, okay, let's see. We'll take a couple more questions because we have 6 more minutes. Sir, Stephen, you have a mic.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Weissman. On this transformation question, it strikes me that Martin Luther King, one of the areas he didn't succeed in was when he came north, and he was really attacking maybe what Ade is talking about, the basic socio-economic structures that were oppressing people. And that particular campaign wasn't successful. And maybe today, if we're in Ferguson or some other place where there's great unrest, we're still dealing with those issues. So that in that case, it wouldn't be that transformative. And the thought also occurred to me, Ralph Bunche, one of the things he had done early I think as an academic perhaps, or as a researcher, he had worked with Gunnar Myrdal, famous scholar who, of course, published this classic work about racism in the United States called An American Dilemma. And he was forecasting almost that because racism was so much against the United States Constitution, the basic constitutional values of a country, that there was a contradiction that could be taken advantage of, and that the civil rights movement, particularly in the South, but also in the North, and Martin Luther King did exactly that, bringing this issue to the fore and making the majority understand how the system was so much against the basic values they pretended to endorse. So anyway, it just struck me that you still have the problem of equal rights in the United States, but we're at a stage now where we've solved the basic dilemma of getting people their constitutional rights, which Bunche was concerned about, but we still haven't attacked the basic structures that still create a largely unequal society.
I'll
Any
take,
thoughts you have?
sorry, I'll take one question and then I'll have to close it off because IT people have to leave. So I'll take the lady right there. Okay, I'll take you if you're quick. I'll take her and then I'll take you. I'm going to give you exactly 20 seconds. So, ma'am, you have 30 seconds. Sorry.
Sorry.
You're using up your time.
Sorry. Okay. It's both historical and it is transformative. And Ade, you are a professor, and you know that it takes a long time, for structures to change. And this thing is talked about, how Obama hasn't been able, to change, the black people's, economic situation. But, he is trying, the poor man is trying. Okay, he has come up, with people are saying, many more things, like their brother's keeper and stuff like that. And we have also had issues like, if you remember the issue of the Texas student who took Texas University to court and because of the affirmative action and said, if we already have, we already have a black person in the White House, so we shouldn't be having affirmative action. Yes, that is correct, but it is basically structural, and structures take a long time to change. And me also having, African American kids, for them just, like my daughter, she's only 13 years and she couldn't go to bed. She waited and watched the State of the Union because President Obama was talking. So it may not change the physical structures, but it's changing the mental structures. It's historical, it's transformative.
He's transformed your daughter, in other words.
Yes,
It's transformed a lot of people. Final word, sir.
I'll try
All
and go
yours.
as fast as I can.
Okay.
Thank you. This question is mostly for Mr. Daniels. Mr. Daniels, you, during your speech, you spoke a little bit about how Martin Luther King to you represents the chief representative, I guess, of the civil rights movement and its chief spokesperson. I guess growing up in a generation that came of age, well, I was born well after his assassination, I think he's taught in schools as so much more than that. He's not just taught as the representative of the civil rights movement. He is the civil rights movement. And do you think, to a certain point, that becomes dangerous to make a figure so central? Does it start to obscure the history and the lessons that we can take from the civil rights movement moving forward? Thank you.
All right, so Ade, I'll give you a minute, final thoughts, and then I'll turn over to Lee for his final thoughts as well, a minute, and then we'll close this off.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. I'll think about your very thoughtful comment, and I basically agree with the way you've posed it, and I'll keep thinking about it. I guess the thing that confuses me a lot is when I hear people say that they voted for Obama's white mother.
Who said that? Never mind.
Yes, I agree that, and we have to focus on, we have to get to a definition we can all agree on what we think the word transformative means in this context, right? Because that's the sticking point. Whether transformative has an immediate impact, or is it we're looking at the long-term impact or the hoped-for impact? King's northern, when you said King's northern movement, the northern movement was a failure. It was an immediate failure. Was it a long-term failure, right? That's what I immediately thought of. Having grown up in Boston where there was a separate school desegregation struggle that had been going on since 1949, right? And it led to the crisis in 1974, which many people consider and will say that busing was a failure. Well, if it was a failure, whose fault was that, right? They kind of imply that, well, busing was a failure because busing is a failure, but that's not true. It's the definitions, right, that are the nub of the issue there. I think I mean, my view is that I see social change as a continuum, right?
Exactly.
As a process. I mean, my point has always been really going back to Du Bois, right? And when Du Bois graduated from Harvard, and his thesis was the first volume of the Harvard Historical Series and so forth and so on. And he came out, and there was nothing for him, right? There was no chair at Harvard. There was no chair at Chicago. There was no chair at Pennsylvania. There was no chair at Yale, Columbia, blah, blah, blah. And he turned this way and that way and this way and that way down through his life to the eve of the March on Washington and said, later for America, right? And died on the eve of the march, died the day before the March on Washington, right? But that...
In Accra.
In Accra, yes. Renounced his American citizenship, so forth and so on. Joined the Communist Party. And to me, that's why I said it's just the struggle, right? And the transformation still from Du Bois in 1895 down to the March on Washington, as I said, you know, black people made a way. That's all we have, right? And so in those terms, that in the long term, transformation is possible. And even out of failure comes transformation, comes movement, right? White America was forced to move. The white minority expanded just enough to get the Civil Rights Acts in. The Voting Rights Act was signed. 6 days later, Watts blew, right? And that was the uncapping of black anger, right? They just got it in time, right? And in the film starts, of course, with the September 15th, 1963 church bombing, right? And that is, I mean, DuVernay was so good in planting that reality. The reality is triumph has always been laced with tragedy. The film ends the same way, right? With when they billboard, okay, who has seen the film? Okay, you know how the film ends, with the billboarding of certain characters, right? And a certain character's billboard, right? When I saw it, and the kids were, by then, the kids in the film were, in the movie house were clapping, right? And then a certain billboard comes up. For those of you who haven't seen it, I won't say. A certain billboard comes up, and the kids stopped clapping because the message was the same as at the very beginning: triumph laced with tragedy. And there would be more tragedy, right? In the next year and the year after that, right? But that's just, it was still transformative.
Regrettably, I have to bring this session to an end, but Adi and I will continue to go at it. But, no, seriously, I thought this was a really good session, and so please join me in thanking our two speakers for coming out and presenting on this book. Thank you very much. And I must thank all of you for braving the bad weather and being here. I wish we had had more people, but this was a much more intimate discussion. We have refreshments outside and book signing, and Ade and Lee will be available outside to sign any books you might purchase out there. So thank you.
Monday,
And thank you, Grace. Thank you, Elizabeth, and the rest of the Wilson Center team. Really appreciate making this program a success.
Well done. It's a shame.